Hey everybody, welcome. My name is Matt Ham, co-founder of Uprint, Faith and Personal Development. This is our weekly conference call with Red Earth. Want to just welcome everybody today. Thank you for jumping on. I appreciate you guys being here. As I was just saying to the team on the call, these are really for you as a community, as individuals, to help bring some encouragement and perspective into your day, because I just said this, is like you don't drift toward excellence. Excellence is something you have to be intentional about moving in that direction. You've got to fight for it. You got to wake up. You have to be focused, and you've got to move forward. If you don't, or if you fail to do that, you're going to drift away from who it is you were created to be and the things that you were created to accomplish. And so these calls are a way to kind of give some nourishment, some encouragement for you guys to chew on and then begin to practice them in your own life. Today, I am going to be talking about one of my favorite Bible stories, and that is David and Goliath. There are 5 kind of key elements that I want to talk about here as it relates to facing down the giants or the impossible things that may be ahead of you, or whatever the opposition is, right? There are things that stand in your way, obstacles, if you will. And I think that David gives us a great 5-fold approach to how we can begin to tackle the obstacles that are ahead of us. Okay, so I'm going to read this story here. It's in 1 Samuel 17:6. As you guys may or may not know, great Bible story. David was a 15-year-old little shepherd boy, okay? And he had been specifically called out by God to be the next king. But nobody expected him to be king because he was a shepherd boy, right? And he had older brothers, and his older brothers fought in the army of Israel, but he was a shepherd boy. He was back home with his dad. And so we're going to pick the story up here. If you ever want to look at it in your own Bible or read about it, it's 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we're going to start in verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, this is Saul the king, the man was already old and advanced in years. That's Jesse. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul into battle. As I said, they were in the army. And the names of the 3 sons who went into battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. But David was the youngest. And the 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Okay, so I'm setting up a story here. You've got the Philistines who are opposing God's people. And it already said that they had a mighty warrior named Goliath who is standing in opposition to God's people. This is the obstacle. No matter who you are, where you are, and you function in your life and business, you're going to be met with obstacles. There are obstacles that stand in front of you. We can call these objections. We can call them excuses. We can call them anything you want to. There are a ton of obstacles that stand in your way. And in this case, you've got Goliath opposing God's army, the Israelites, and here's David. But it's interesting that David does not go and fight Goliath immediately. This is the first point that I want to really bring home for you guys when you faced obstacles, and it's this: there must be a season of preparation. You see, so many people go into battle without being prepared. And they just rely on their own strength, and they rely on their grit and their tenacity, and you don't know who I am. I'm going to get it done type of person. And they go into battle without preparation. They go into battle without preparation. We have a dynamic problem, I think, in our culture, is that we don't like preparation. In fact, we do everything we possibly can to avoid preparation because we are impatient. We microwave our food. We go through the drive-thru to get fast food. Boom, 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 boom. I want it now. But true victory and overcoming obstacles never happens that way. There's always great preparation before any step of victory. It's 1,000 drips of water on a rock that erodes the rock. Now, that 1,000th drip of water might actually go through the rock, but you don't see the 999 drips ahead of that actually break through the stone. See, so often it's easy for us to focus on what we don't have in the moment because we're unwilling to prepare and be faithful to kind of continue the process, because it's the 1,000th chop of the axe that knocks down the tree, not the 746th. And it's really easy to get distracted, to get frustrated, to get cynical, to get jaded, to complain during that season of preparation. It's interesting that David was prepared for 40 days as well. Later in the story, you see Jesus being prepared for 40 days in the wilderness when he was tempted ahead of stepping into his own ministry. So there's something to be said here for this 40 days of preparation. And I think that it's important for us to make sure that we are being prepared properly. So how do you prepare properly? Maybe that's a good question. Practically, how do you prepare properly? I think one of the things that you can do to prepare properly is to learn, is to slow down and learn. Instead of wondering why something has happened, maybe ask, what can I learn from this having happened? Right? When you have a situation that comes upon you and you don't know how to respond and you're frustrated, you can get cynical, you can get jaded, you can lash out, you can blame everybody else. You can say, what can I learn from this? What have I done in this that I can improve upon? How can I get better? How can I prepare? How can I be prepared through this moment? It's a very practical thing with every single instance that we face in our lives. We can live holding on to bitterness and anger and frustration and all these different things, or we can be prepared to actually be free from those things so that when our moment comes, we can overcome the obstacle instead of just being another excuse as to why we didn't achieve it. All right, so be prepared, number one. So here's David. He's back and forth from going to the front lines and then feeding his father's sheep. 40 days. He's being prepared. We're going to see why later, but he's being prepared. Well, finally, David comes to the front lines and he's taking some supplies to his brothers, okay? So you have David going to the front lines and he's got his supplies for his brothers, and he gets up there, and this is in verse 23. Or 22, and David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. Okay, so David did what his father asked. He took the stuff and then he goes and greets his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, named Goliath, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard them. Okay, setting this up again. David, shepherd boy, back and forth. The frontline Israelites are fighting the Philistines. They're sending down this giant named Goliath who's cursing them and who's cursing their God for 40 days, and nobody does anything. And here comes David. And it says, and David heard it. When David hears this obstacle, when he perceives that there is an obstacle, the first thing he does is he knows that he was made to overcome it. David has a belief of that as an overcomer, because all of the men fled, but David is the one who stood up. And in fact, David says, wait a second, what's going on with this situation? Why is nobody fighting? Who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of God? This is verse 26. And now, Here's the next point 2 I want to make, okay? So when you see an obstacle, know that you were created to overcome it. That's the courage of David, right? Know that you were created as an overcomer. You're a victor, not a victim. You were created as an overcomer. But when you have the courage to stand up and declare that you're a victor, you are going to be criticized. Here's point number 2 for you guys when you step into overcoming the obstacles ahead of you. You have to reject the criticism of the people around you. This is verse 28, 1 Samuel 17:28. Now Eliab, the eldest brother of David, heard when David spoke up. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. You ever tried to step up and do something right, and somebody condemns you for it? You ever try to be an overcomer, and somebody tells you you can't? You ever tried to step into an obstacle, and you immediately get the criticism of people? This is King David, and this is where if you want to overcome the obstacles, you have to reject the criticism of the masses, especially those that are closest to you. Now, here's the interesting piece. You have to be mature enough to discern between criticism of people versus the correction of the Lord. You see, because if you are humble, you receive a correction from the Lord. But when you are also humble and someone criticizes you, you know that it conflicts with what God's called you to do. See, this is where a lot of people get confused because they're actually receiving correction from the Lord. Somebody loves them enough to say, "Hey, man, you're probably not doing this right." They go, "You just don't know me. I'm just fighting. I'm just standing up." And their pride and their ego is getting in the way. But if you're humble enough, you can discern the difference between criticism and correction. Criticism and correction. The interesting thing is criticism is going to belittle you, where correction is going to remind you of who you are. Criticism says you're not good enough. Correction says you're better than this. There's a subtle difference here that most people overlook. But this is where we see David. Now, the interesting piece is, how do you respond to criticism? Well, most people respond by getting in an argument. Most people go, "Well, you don't know me, and da-da-da, and I'll show you, and da-da-da," and it's all about human strength and willpower. That's not what David does. David answers his older brother. Verse 29, and David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered as before. You see, when you get criticism, you don't have to argue with the person to prove you're right. That again shows your ego, and it shows your pride, and it shows your desire to be right. Instead, what you have to do is you have to ignore those people. Those who can see me on video now, if your hand is in front of you, you can argue with it all day and you can ignore it all day, but if it's still in front of you, it's still in your periphery. What you have to do is put it out of your periphery, put it behind you. You can't see it anymore. David turns from the criticism of his brother and he focuses on the task at hand, his obstacle, his giant. See, right now, some of you are probably receiving some level of criticism and you're arguing with that criticism, trying to prove that you're right instead of just moving forward. Some of you are probably dealing with correction and calling it criticism because you're not humble enough to receive correction. We have to stand to receive correction. And this is a powerful thing. You'll never grow beyond the conversations you are unwilling to have. You have to have a desire to grow beyond. And that's where most people fail because they refuse to grow beyond those limiting beliefs, those limiting thoughts, those limiting behaviors. And so here's David. He's willing to be prepared and he's humble enough to discern between criticism and correction. And he rejects the criticism. He rejects the criticism. If you live your life trying to please people, you're ultimately going to fail. And that's the mistake most of us make. We live our lives trying to please people. We're called to serve people. Please God, serve people. That's the way that we would teach it. And the difference between pleasing people and serving them is very, very, very different. So, continue on in the story here. When the words of David were heard, they were repeated before Saul. It's interesting here. The words of David, the courage of David gets to the king. The king himself sees his courage. You can see courage. When somebody's bold enough to stand up and face their obstacles, kings find out about it. It will take you in front of great people if you're courageous enough to step into your gift and step into overcoming obstacles. They were repeated before Saul. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of this man." He's talking about this giant. He's like, "I got this," basically. But the king looks at him and goes, "You're but a youth. Come home, man. You got to be kidding me. There's no way you're going to do that. You're just a kid." Again, the criticism of others. But David knows who he is, and here's what's interesting. David looks at the king as a 15-year-old kid talking to a grown man, the king of all people. And he says, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father." Remember the 40 days in the wilderness? Remember what I told you about? His preparation? This is amazing. You guys listen to this. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." Y'all, David is bad. He said, "While I was in the field being prepared, keeping sheep, lions and bears used to come to take the sheep, and I used to grab the lions and the bears by the beard and struck them down and killed them." During your preparation, there are things that are going to happen that will prepare you for your future moment. And you may be in a season of preparation right now. You might think you're facing a giant, but what you're actually doing is facing a lion or bear that's preparing you for a future giant that is coming. Because here's the cool thing. David says this in verse 37, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the Philistine." What's he doing there? David is using the power of testimony. You see, if you are well prepared, if you prepare well, when you come to your obstacle, you can go, "I remember when I was being prepared, and God was faithful then, and he'll be faithful now." I want to tell you guys a personal story in my own life. When I was selling real estate, we had gone down to Florida, kind of chasing the dream. Things were crazy, busted at the seams. We were selling hot and fast, but the market was turning. And I was a 25-year-old kid chasing my opportunity to become a salesperson. I had purchased a house down in Florida on a stated income, 100% financing, 2004, 2005, what I call stupid loan. I didn't have to put any money down, and I bought a house for $279,000 on a guaranteed fixed income of like 40 grand, and I had about 40 grand in incentives or bonuses that I could have made. So the crazy thing is we got relocated because the market started to shift, and we were shipped up to one of the projects in South Carolina that we were doing at the time. But I still had a $279,000 house down in Florida. Not fun, okay? I remember I got to a point, I was on the front sales line. I had no money, and I was absolutely dirt broke, and I had a $279,000 house in Florida that was bleeding me dry. And I remember I came home one night when I was in the community in South Carolina, and I hadn't made any sales, and I was absolutely broken. I had $6,000 in bills due, and I had $3,000 left in the bank. And I remember weeping and telling my wife, I said, "Babe, we're done. I don't know what to do. We're done." And her grandfather had just passed away. And when he died, he left $6,000 or $7,000 in stock to each grandkid. My wife was gracious enough. We agreed to cash in that stock and use it to get through that month. And we did. It was just enough provision for that moment. What happened after that is I made a couple sales. I ended up becoming the salesperson of the year at that community. Made a good bit of money, probably made about $150,000 that next year. And then things shifted again. I moved to a new project in the mountains. Things did not go well. The market was collapsing. It was 2008. And I moved back into my parents' room over the garage. Again, I was broke. Had about $5,000, $6,000 in bills each month. And this time I maybe had like $15,000 or $20,000 left in the bank. So I had a couple of months. But I remembered what God had done in the past. And so I said, "I know that you took care of us back then. You're going to take care of us now." And so I stepped into a career in insurance. And that career in insurance proved to be very profitable, became one of the top agents in our company, got to the point where I was making significant six-figure income, and we were completely taken care of again. Well, then God called us on a new journey, and he asked me to step away from that to start our company, UPrint, and to do some of our nonprofit and charitable work. So I walked away from this multiple six-figure income. What's interesting about this, guys, is we got to a point last summer where we were basically back down to that broke moment again. You know, we had some equity in our house, but we had $10,000 of bills each month with this family of 7. And we had maybe like $30,000, $40,000 left in the bank. But I said, I know God's faithful because he did it back then he did it that next time. He's going to do it now. And the Lord in that moment asked us to sell a couple of assets, and we did, and we had enough cash to get through. Well, today I sit before you in that same moment. You know, here we are. And I know, though, that God has been faithful in my own past. He will be faithful again. You see, David shows us that it's the testimony of God that we stand on, not our own strength. So many people are like, look at what I did. Look at what I did. I dug up myself out of that hole. Well, if it's on your own strength, then it's yours to uphold it. If it's on God's strength, it's on his reputation. And I stand here today saying that God has been faithful in my life to deliver and make true on his promises. He delivered me from the paw of the lion and bear. He'll deliver me from the Philistine. So testimony is a powerful thing. So for you guys, what I want to encourage you to look back on how God's been faithful in your life. Look back on all the things that have happened to bring you to this point where you are. Remember the difficult times. Remember the difficult moments. And look at where you are now. Know that you have good victory ahead of you because you've had good victory in your past. Stand on the power of testimony and declare it as you move forward instead of, letting your thoughts attack you about what's not going to happen and how bad it's going to be and all this kind of stuff. So number 1, willing to be prepared. Number 2, reject the criticism of others. Number 3, stand on the testimony of your past as you step into your future. Number 4, go down a little further. It says, verse 38, Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped the sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. But then David looked at the king and said, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David took off the armor of the king. And he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 stones from the brook and put him in his shepherd's pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. What is this about? You see, a lot of times in our life when we're looking to overcome obstacles, we focus on the strategies of the king, the armor of the king, as I'm going to call it here. That's in kind of parentheses. You see, everybody has an opinion about what it is that you should do. Everybody has a strategy. Everybody has their own, kind of take on how you should fight your battles and how you should overcome your obstacles. Now, I'm not saying they're all bad because the armor of Saul was helpful in helping him have his own battles. But here's the thing. David knew that David had to fight with the weaponry that he was given. You see, David was a shepherd. He fought with a sling and stones. He didn't fight with armor like everybody else. I think a lot of people get tied up on focusing on best practices. And there is wisdom there, but at the end of the day, you have to fight with the weapons that you've been given. Only you have your personality. Only you have your gift set. You have to use that gift set to your advantage when you're overcoming obstacles. You're going to tackle an obstacle a lot different than I'm going to tackle an obstacle. But you have to be willing to set aside best practices and everybody's opinion of how you should do this and trade it for who you are. God's already given you what you need to overcome the obstacles ahead of you. Maybe that's 5 smooth stones. Maybe it's a sling, whatever it looks like for you. It's not going to make sense to other people. Can you imagine going into a battle with a giant and the king giving you his sword and you go, no thanks, I'm going to set the sword down and pick up 5 little rocks. It's stupid. It makes no sense. But this is the testimony of victory. This is the testimony of victory. You and I, we have to fight with what we've been given instead of what everybody else tells us we need to fight with. But that requires us being humble enough and quiet enough to know how we're supposed to fight the battle. God has given you everything you need to overcome the obstacles ahead of you. The problem is you have to slow down your mind and your own understanding and the noise of everything else to actually step into it. So the 4th thing is reject the king's armor and fight with what you've been given. So as you guys step into the obstacles ahead of you, and I really hope all this is connecting because I'm telling you, this is ridiculously powerful, eternal stuff here. This works all the time. All the time. You got to prepare. You got to reject criticism. You have to stand on testimony, and you've got to fight with the weapons that you've been given. That's the gifts that you have. Not everybody else. It's not going to look the same. All these 5 points to this book and 4 principles to this. Listen, I wrote one of them. Might not work for you. That's fine. Doesn't mean there's not truth in it. There is truth in it. But you have to understand who you are uniquely. So we know the story here. David goes running to the giant. The giant chastises him and says, I'm going to kill you and feed you to the birds. And then David raises him and says, no, I'm going to kill you and cut off your head, and then we're going to take over your entire army. I love it. There's an incredible amount of supreme confidence in David. So David does. It says he runs toward the giant. He picks up a sling, boom, throws the rock. Giant falls dead, picks up, chops off his head, and then the army is encouraged. the army is empowered by David's action, and the army goes and conquers the rest of the Philistines. And here's what I want to say about that. When you step up to the obstacles ahead of you, when you step up and step into the giants that are ahead of you, the people that are following you will be encouraged. The people, actually, there are those of you that are in leadership right now, and people around you are so desperate for you to be courageous and step up and lead. And I'm not just talking about within the roles of the organization and sales. There are people in your life who look to you as a leader, and they're waiting on you to lead. And your courage and your willingness to step in to the battle ahead and to the obstacles ahead is going to empower them. But when you cower down and hunker down and come up with excuses and don't fight the battle, it actually trickles downhill to them too. So this is a call for us to stand up and step into these roles of leadership and these obstacles that are before us as victors, because it empowers the people around us. Otherwise, we're just being passive sheep and we're just going to get run all over. I'm telling you right now, in the world, the earth is looking for these types of people to step up and step in. But again, as we see this entire story, it doesn't look like everybody thinks it's going to look. It's a little old 15-year-old shepherd with 5 stones that's going to take down the giant. And here's the final thing, and I love this. This is verse 54. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. All right, y'all, think about this. He took the head of the giant to Jerusalem. It's like he's a deer hunter, and he took the head and he put it on the wall. I mean, this is crazy. It's a little bit grotesque, but think about this. He took the head to Jerusalem, but he put the armor in his tent. What does that have to do with anything? David had something that reminded him of victory. He celebrated the victory. I think about this down the road when David eventually became king. Can you imagine if he had the armor of the giant like hanging in the foyer of the palace? How awesome would that be? Somebody comes into the palace and goes, "What is that 12-foot armor over there?" "Oh, that's the giant that I killed." Like how incredible would that be? I mean, how much does that speak to his character? And here's the point of that. Celebrate your victories. It's okay to celebrate your victories, right? It's not about being gaudy. And I mean, everyone is selling insurance, right? They all gave us these rings and these plaques to hang on the wall. And, it was like a rite of passage. And you walk into the guy's office and see all the plaques and stuff. And, it's one thing to idolize the victories of your past. It's another thing to celebrate them. You never want to idolize the victories of your past because, see, God gets credit for it. David was different. He gave God credit for him instead of taking credit himself. It's okay to celebrate the victories when God gets credit. In fact, he gets credit and you get the victory. I remember when you walked into the office, at my old insurance office, I had all these plaques on this entire wall, and they spoke of the victories of success within my business. Now, there was a tension there to idolize them and make it about, look at my wall, look at how, and take pictures and share it on social media. I'm not saying to do all that, but be faithful enough to celebrate the victories. The question is who gets the credit? David gave God the credit. The problem is most of us, including myself, want to take the credit and pretend like it's my strength that did it, my understanding, my salesmanship, etc. So, kind of wrapping up today, guys, 5 kind of ways or 5 specific things to think about when you're overcoming the obstacles ahead of you. Number 1, be willing to be prepared. Number 2, reject the criticism of those around you and be willing to discern the difference between criticism and correction. Number 3, stand on the testimonies of the past. Number 4, make sure you're fighting with the weaponry that the Lord has given you. And sometimes that requires rejecting the opinions of people and what's worked for them in the past. It's about what the Lord wants you to fight with. And then finally, number 5, be sure to celebrate victory. Be sure to celebrate victory. But when you celebrate, don't take credit. He gets credit, we get victory. So that's all for today's call. If you guys have any questions or want to talk about it any further, feel free to give me a shout. Matt@uprint.life or 910-619-4644 on the cell. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.